David King wasn't born into hardship. He was born into privilege. Growing up in Manchester as the only child of a wealthy family, every opportunity was laid out in front of him. He was intelligent, athletic, and naturally gifted. By all accounts, David should have had an incredible future. But there was one problem. David loved to fight. Not because he wanted money, not because he wanted attention. He loved the rush that came from standing toe-to-toe with someone and refusing to back down. That drive led him to professional rugby, where his aggression quickly made him one of the league's brightest young stars. But it also destroyed his career. After assaulting a referee during a match, David was banned from the sport for life. Most people would have seen it as the worst day of their lives. David barely cared. With his family's money keeping him comfortable, he drifted from one bar to the next, earning cash through underground bare-knuckle fights and collecting debts for dangerous people. Violence became less of a job and more of an identity, because fighting was easy. Facing himself was not. David's temper didn't come from nowhere. Behind closed doors, his father ruled the household through intimidation and control. One day, after years of watching his mother endure it, David finally snapped. When his father raised a hand toward her again, David caught his arm, and then he beat him so badly that his father threw him out of the family home for good. It was the first time David ever stood up to the man who had shaped his entire life, but instead of freedom, he found himself completely alone. Without his family's money, the life he'd taken for granted disappeared almost overnight. His old friends vanished. The people who once surrounded him suddenly had no use for him. The only person who stayed was Donnie. Unlike everyone else, Donnie had known David long before the money, the fame, or the reputation. He offered him a couch to sleep on when nobody else would. And for the first time in years, David had somebody he could actually call a friend. Trying to rebuild his life wasn't easy. He bounced between jobs, worked behind bars, and stepped back into underground fighting just to make ends meet. But something had changed. During one match against a fighter known as the Ghetto Masher, David froze. For the first time in his life, he wasn't fighting his father. He wasn't fighting years of anger. He was just fighting another man, and he lost. The defeat shook him more than any punch ever could. It forced him to ask a question he'd spent his whole life avoiding. If he wasn't fueled by anger anymore, then who was he? That question followed him everywhere, especially during the long conversations he had with his bartender friend Rick. Rick never judged David. Instead, he told stories. Stories about people who wasted their lives pretending to be someone they weren't. Stories about regret, stories about fear, about choosing comfort over honesty. At first, that made David roll his eyes. Then, he started listening, because every story pointed toward the one thing he refused to confront. Years earlier, David had met someone named Tristan. They first met as children at music camp and stayed close for years. Tristan made David laugh, challenged him, and accepted him without asking him to become someone else. As they grew older, their friendship became something deeper. But David's parents cared more about the King family name than their son's happiness. They expected him to marry the right woman, protect the family's image, and never step outside the life they'd planned for him. David never told them the truth. Instead, every time Tristan asked for something real, David walked away. Not because he didn't love him, but because he was terrified. Eventually, Tristan decided he couldn't keep waiting. He accepted a piano job in New York and prepared to leave England behind. When David heard the news, the walls he'd spent years building around him finally collapsed. He rushed to the airport, desperate to stop making the same mistakes he'd made over and over again. When he finally found Tristan, all of the speeches he'd imagined disappeared. No dramatic confession, no perfect words. After years of hiding behind anger, pride, and fear, David looked him in the eye and simply said, "No more bullshit." It wasn't poetic. It wasn't elegant. But for David, it was the most honest thing he'd ever said. Tristan didn't immediately forgive him. He didn't promise to stay. He only asked for time, and surprisingly, that was enough. For the first time in his life, David had chosen honesty instead of fear. Whatever happened next, he knew he'd finally stopped pretending to be someone else. Walking home through the rain, David felt lighter than he had ever felt before. For once, the future didn't scare him. And then he heard Tristan's voice. He looked up and saw him standing in the park. David smiled and rushed toward him. But the moment they touched, Tristan crumbled into black petals that dissolved into a rolling sea of fog. Figures emerged from the darkness. Every bully, every criminal, every man David had ever put in the ground. Without hesitation, he raised his fists. One final fight. And then the fog closed around him.